In the winter of 1744, a procession of carriages moved eastward through a landscape slowly disappearing beneath snow. Inside one of them sat a German princess 14 years of age. Her name was Sophie Friedrich August von Anhalt-Zerbst. She had no army, no fortune of her own, and no natural claim to the Russian throne. She did not yet speak Russian. She had been raised as a Lutheran, while the empire awaiting her was bound to the traditions of Russian Orthodoxy. She was traveling toward a young man she scarcely knew, and toward a marriage arranged not for affection, but for dynasty, diplomacy, and the uncertain future of the Romanov line. The road before her was long. Beyond the frozen glass lay forests, villages, and distances greater than anything she had known. Russia seemed to stretch without end, from its Baltic territories in the west toward Siberia and the Pacific, across rivers, plains, and settlements joined more by imperial authority than by any simple sense of unity. To the girl in the carriage it was a foreign world. Yet less than 19 years later, this outsider would take the imperial throne in a coup against her own husband. She would rule for 34 years, correspond with the leading philosophers of Europe, enlarge Russia's borders, collect art on an imperial scale, and preside over wars that carried Russian power toward the Black Sea. She would also preserve an autocratic system founded on privilege and serfdom. Her reign would bring reform and repression, brilliance and violence, intellectual ambition and political calculation. Admirers would celebrate her as an enlightened ruler. Enemies would describe her as a usurper. Later generations would surround her with legends, some flattering, many obscene, and several entirely false. History would remember her as Catherine the Great. But on that winter road there was no Catherine yet. There was only Sophie. How did a minor German princess, brought to Russia as a possible bride, learn to command enough loyalty to seize an empire? How did someone born outside Russia persuade soldiers, nobles, churchmen, and officials that she could embody the state more convincingly than the man who had inherited its crown? The answer did not begin with an army. It began with observation. Sophie was born on May 2, 1729 in Stettin, a Prussian city in Pomerania, known today as Szczecin in Poland. Her father, Christian August of Anhalt-Zerbst, was a prince by rank and a general in Prussian service. Her mother, Johanna Elisabeth of Holstein-Gottorp, belonged to a family with useful connections among the courts of Northern Europe. The title of princess suggested grandeur, but Sophie did not come from one of Europe's great ruling houses. Anhalt-Zerbst was a small German principality, one among the many territories of the Holy Roman Empire. Its name carried noble ancestry, yet it could not compare in wealth or military power with Austria, France, Prussia, or Russia. For families like Sophie's, marriage was not merely private. It was one of the few instruments available for rising in the elaborate hierarchy of European courts. A daughter might become the link between houses, the quiet foundation of an alliance, or the mother of a future monarch. Her personality mattered, but so did her health, religion, ancestry, manners, and presumed ability to produce children. Sophie therefore received the education expected of a young German princess. She learned French, the common language of European high society, along with etiquette and Lutheran instruction. She read, listened, and learned how status could be expressed through small gestures. The proper greeting, the measured reply, the ability to conceal discomfort. Accounts of her childhood, including her own later recollections, portray an intelligent, lively, and strong-willed girl. But those recollections require caution. Catherine wrote and revised her memoirs after reaching power. Like most political memoirs, they did more than preserve memory. They also shaped reputation. In them, the future empress often appears observant and disciplined, while those who later became her enemies appear foolish, unstable, or cruel. Her memories remain invaluable, but they cannot be treated as a window untouched by ambition. Far to the east, the Russian succession had become a matter of urgency. Empress Elizabeth, daughter of Peter the Great, had seized the throne in 1741. She was unmarried and had no acknowledged children. To secure the dynasty, she summoned her nephew, Karl Peter Ulrich of Holstein-Gottorp, the son of her late sister Anna and a grandson of Peter the Great. The boy was brought to Russia, received into the Orthodox Church, renamed Peter Fyodorovich, and declared heir. But an heir needed a wife, and a wife was expected to provide the next generation. Sophie emerged as a candidate through a web of family loyalties and international politics. Elizabeth had old emotional ties to the Holstein family. Sophie's mother promoted the match, while Frederick II of Prussia also favored a bride unlikely to strengthen Austrian influence at the Russian court. No single person controlled the decision. It grew from several interests meeting at the same point, and at that point stood a 14-year-old girl. Early in 1744, Sophie and her mother received the summons to Russia. Her father remained behind. The departure meant more than an extended visit. If Sophie succeeded, she would change her faith, her name, her country, and perhaps even the habits by which she understood herself. If she failed to please Empress Elizabeth, she could be sent home, carrying the embarrassment of a broken dynastic plan. The journey led them through Prussian and Russian territories toward Moscow, where the imperial court was then residing. They arrived in February. The city was not the orderly stone capital imagined by Western Europeans when they thought of imperial power. Moscow was older, wider, and more irregular. Churches and palaces rose above roofs of timber, bells sounded over snow-covered streets, and smoke drifted into the winter air. At court, wealth announced itself in silk, jewels, uniforms, icons, candlelight, and ritual. Empress Elizabeth was renowned for magnificence, but magnificence did not make her harmless. She owed her crown to a palace coup and understood how quickly loyalties could change. Warmth and severity could exist side by side in her rule. She welcomed Sophie, yet the young princess was being examined from the moment she arrived. Peter, the intended bridegroom, was 16. Catherine's later memoirs describe him as childish, indiscreet, and emotionally detached from Russia. According to her account, he was initially pleased to see her and treated her as a cousin in whom he could confide. He allegedly spoke of his feelings for another young woman and presented marriage to Sophie as obedience to his aunt rather than a choice of his own. The private details are difficult to verify independently. Peter's reputation was largely written by people who benefited from his overthrow, and historians must therefore resist turning him into a caricature. He had been orphaned young, moved between cultures, pressured to abandon one royal future for another, and subjected to an education that appears to have been harsh and confused. None of this made the later marriage happy. But it reminds us that two vulnerable adolescents had been placed inside a dynastic arrangement neither had designed. Sophie understood at least one thing very quickly. Affection from Peter would not be enough to secure her future. She needed Elizabeth's approval. She needed to satisfy the Orthodox Church. Beyond the palace, she needed to appear willing to become Russian. Tutors were assigned to teach her the language, the Orthodox faith, and courtly accomplishments. Sophie applied herself to the task with unusual intensity. In her later memoirs, she claimed that she remained awake after others had gone to sleep, sitting up in bed and repeating Russian lessons by heart. She also said that, inexperienced with the climate, she studied without shoes or stockings in her heated room and soon developed a dangerous illness, described as pleurisy. The story may be broadly true, but its most dramatic details come from Sophie herself, writing years later with full knowledge of the woman she had become. It is also a nearly perfect political story. The foreign girl suffers because she is working so hard to learn the language of her adopted country. For that reason, it should be remembered with both sympathy and caution. What is not in doubt is that she became seriously ill soon after her arrival. For weeks, fever and pain confined her to bed. 18th-century physicians repeatedly bled her, a treatment then considered respectable but dangerous by modern standards. Her mother objected to the doctor's methods. Elizabeth intervened and placed members of the Russian court around the patient. Sophie later recalled another episode from the illness. When her mother wished to bring a Lutheran clergyman, the girl supposedly asked instead for the Orthodox teacher assigned to her. Even Catherine admitted that she learned some details of the incident from others, so the precise words cannot be confirmed. Yet the political effect was real. The Russian court saw a foreign princess apparently turning toward its faith at the moment she seemed closest to death. When Sophie finally recovered, she was pale, thin, and weakened. But her position was stronger than it had been before the fever. She had demonstrated, whether by instinct, conviction, calculation, or some mixture of all three, that she understood the kind of transformation Russia required from her. On June 28, 1744, according to the calendar then used in Russia, Sophie formally entered the Russian Orthodox Church. She received a new name, Ekaterina Alexeyevna, Catherine Alexeyevna. The following day she was formally betrothed to Peter Fyodorovich. Conversion in an 18th-century royal court was both religious and political. We cannot measure with certainty what the 15-year-old believed in private. What can be said is that she learned the forms of orthodoxy carefully, accepted the public identity expected of a Russian Grand Duchess, and performed that identity more convincingly than many around her had anticipated. The change of name marked a boundary. Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst had crossed into Russia carrying little more than ancestry, education, and possibility. Catherine Alexeyevna now stood near the line of succession. She still possessed no independent authority. Every privilege could be withdrawn by Elizabeth. Her future depended on a young man whose interests seemed to lie elsewhere, and on a court where affection could become suspicion without warning. The wedding would take place in 1745. The marriage would not become the partnership its architects intended. Years of loneliness, surveillance, humiliation, reading and careful alliance building lay ahead. Yet the first lesson had already been learned. Power did not always begin with command. Sometimes it began with the ability to enter a room as a stranger, listen while others underestimated you, and slowly discover what each person feared, desired, and needed to believe. Outside, the Russian winter continued. Snow gathered along palace roofs and darkened roads. Fires burned behind high windows. The foreign girl had not conquered an empire, nor could she have known with certainty that she ever would. But she had survived her arrival. And in the dangerous world of the Romanov court, survival was the first form of power. On August 21, 1745, according to the calendar then used in Russia, Catherine Alexeyevna married Grand Duke Peter Fyodorovich in St. Petersburg. She was 16. He was 17. The ceremony was magnificent, as a Romanov wedding was expected to be. There were jewels, embroidered garments, solemn prayers, formal processions, banquets, music, and days of celebration. To those watching, the marriage appeared to secure the future of the dynasty. The heir chosen by Empress Elizabeth now had an Orthodox bride. In time, everyone assumed children would follow. But ceremony could create the appearance of unity. It could not create intimacy. Behind the illuminated windows, Catherine entered a marriage that would remain emotionally distant and, for years, apparently without children. Her mother left Russia shortly after the wedding. Johanna Elizabeth had become entangled in diplomatic intrigue and had lost Elizabeth's confidence. Mother and daughter would never meet again. Catherine was now separated from her birthplace, her family, and the religion of her childhood. She had acquired a place close to the Russian throne, but she had also become more alone than ever. The young couple lived within a court that treated them less like independent adults than valuable, and potentially dangerous, possessions of the state. Their movements were observed. Access to them could be restricted. Letters were controlled, conversations reported, and members of their household dismissed or reassigned. Empress Elizabeth's conduct toward Catherine was not simply cruel. At times she was generous, protective, and openly affectionate. She had chosen Catherine, preserved the marriage despite the schemes of Catherine's mother, and given the young Grand Duchess status, money, and a possible imperial future. But Elizabeth was also an autocrat who had gained power through a coup. She knew that the heir and his wife might one day become the center of rival factions. Affection did not remove suspicion. In the Romanov court, supervision was considered a form of security. Madame Chaglakova was placed in Catherine's household as a senior attendant and intermediary. Catherine's memoirs portray her as intrusive, moralizing, and frequently unbearable. Orders from the Empress were delivered through her. At certain moments, attendants were forbidden to whisper to Catherine or speak to the young couple except where others could hear. Catherine later described this existence as a kind of imprisonment. Her language is dramatic, and it comes from a memoir written by a woman who eventually overthrew the dynasty's lawful heir. Yet the broader pattern is well documented. privacy was scarce, correspondence was dangerous, and the Grand Duchess learned that even an innocent remark could be repeated in a hostile form. She responded by becoming careful. She watched faces before speaking. She remembered who carried information to whom. She learned when silence was safer than explanation and when public obedience could conceal private disagreement. This was an education no tutor had formally planned. Peter found his own escapes. At Oranienbaum, the residence associated with the young court, he devoted much of his energy to Holstein affairs, military exercises, hunting, music, uniforms, and the company of attendants who shared his interests. Catherine's memoirs repeatedly mock his fascination with soldiers and drill. Those descriptions may contain truth, but they also helped her present him as childish and unfit to rule. Peter was more complicated than that portrait suggests. He had a serious attachment to Holstein, the land of his childhood, and he admired the disciplined military culture of Frederick II of Prussia. He also struggled to identify with the empire he was expected to inherit. What comforted him privately could damage him politically. Every Holstein uniform and every expression of admiration for Prussia made parts of the Russian court wonder where his deepest loyalty lay. The marriage between Peter and Catherine did not become a partnership. They sometimes shared jokes, confidences, or moments of cooperation, especially when imperial restrictions frustrated them both. At other times they lived increasingly separate lives. For many years no child was born. The precise reasons remain uncertain. Later stories attributed the delay to Peter's health, immaturity, or a physical condition that may have been corrected by surgery. Much of this evidence comes from Catherine's memoirs, court gossip, and later retellings. It cannot be established with confidence. What is certain is that the absence of an heir placed enormous pressure on both husband and wife, and especially on Catherine. If she could not produce a child, her usefulness to the dynasty might end. Within this guarded world, Catherine discovered a form of freedom that could be hidden in plain sight. She read. At first, according to her own account, she read novels. They offered temporary escape from repetitive ceremonies, strained conversations, and the long empty hours of court life. Gradually, her reading became more deliberate. She sought history, political thought, law, and philosophy. She read in French, continued working with Russian texts, and treated books as private instructors. Among the authors who shaped her were Plutarch, Tacitus, and Montesquieu. She later recalled that Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Laws and the Annals of Tacitus changed the way she understood the world around her. Tacitus, writing about intrigue and fear under Roman emperors, taught her to search beneath noble language for concealed interests. Montesquieu encouraged her to think about law, institutions, climate, custom, and the forces that limited or sustained political authority. This did not turn Catherine into a modern democrat. She remained a woman preparing to live near the center of an autocratic state. But reading gave her a vocabulary with which to analyze power rather than merely endure it. At night, while palace corridors grew quiet, the outsider was building an inner country of her own, a place made from history, argument, memory, and ambition. She also continued to study Russia itself. She attended Orthodox services, observed public rituals, followed court relationships, and improved her ability to present herself as a Russian Grand Duchess. She rode confidently, danced, and appeared at ceremonies even when ill or exhausted. These actions were not evidence that the entire population loved her. Most inhabitants of the empire would never see her. But among the narrow circles that shaped succession, the court, the guards, senior clergy, diplomats, and noble families, her reputation was slowly becoming distinct from Peter's. As the marriage deteriorated, both spouses looked elsewhere for companionship. Peter formed attachments to other women. Catherine entered relationships of her own. Her association with the officer Sergei Saltykov became especially important during the long effort to produce an heir. In 1754, after previous failed pregnancies, Catherine gave birth to a son, Paul Petrovich. Paul was officially and legally Peter's child. Court gossip claimed that Saltykov was the biological father, and Catherine's later memoirs encouraged that suspicion without providing proof. Other evidence has been used to argue that Peter may indeed have been Paul's father. Without genetic evidence, the question cannot be settled. A responsible account must leave it unresolved. For the dynasty, however, there was no official uncertainty. Paul was recognized as Peter's son and as a future Romanov heir. His birth should have secured Catherine's position and given her a new emotional center. Instead, it deepened her isolation. Empress Elizabeth took control of the infant almost immediately and supervised his upbringing as a child of the state. This was not entirely unusual in royal dynasties, where heirs belonged politically to the ruling house. But Catherine was allowed only limited contact with her son. In her memoirs, she remembered lying alone after the birth while celebrations continued elsewhere in the palace. The scene became one of the defining memories of her early life in Russia. The mother who had fulfilled her duty, separated from the child who made that duty complete. She returned to her books. Around this period, her reading widened further. Yet knowledge alone could not protect her. She needed relationships, and she began to cultivate them with greater skill. She listened to diplomats, spoke cautiously with ministers, and maintained connections through trusted servants and courtiers. Some ties were romantic, some intellectual, and some openly political. Often they were all three at once. This was not yet a conspiracy to seize the throne. Catherine's immediate goal was survival. But survival at court required information, and information created influence. In 1756, the 7 Years' War began transforming the political atmosphere of Europe. Russia entered the struggle against Frederick II's Prussia. Russian soldiers fought and died while Peter continued to admire the Prussian king. Peter's admiration had personal and strategic roots, but at court it became increasingly dangerous. Catherine, though born in Prussian territory, took care to identify herself with Russian interests. The contrast between husband and wife grew sharper. Then, in 1758, Chancellor Alexei Bestuzhev-Ryumin was arrested and stripped of office. Bestuzhev had communicated with Catherine and regarded her as politically significant. When members of his network were detained, Catherine understood that her own letters and private connections could place her in danger. She ordered her papers and account books collected and burned them. This image comes from her memoirs, but it carries the weight of a genuine political crisis. Catherine standing before a fire, watching written traces of her private world disappear before investigators could use them. She was not formally convicted of treason. She survived questioning and suspicion, while Bestuzhev was removed from power. But the experience taught her how quickly a court acquaintance could become a state prisoner, and how thin the line was between imperial family member and political suspect. By the final years of Elizabeth's reign, Catherine was no longer the frightened teenager who had arrived through the snow. She was still watched. She was still vulnerable. Her husband increasingly favored Elizabeth Vorontsova, while his affection for Prussia alienated influential Russians. Catherine, meanwhile, had learned the language of the court, studied the machinery of power, endured the removal of friends, and formed connections of her own. When Empress Elizabeth died in December 1761, Peter became Emperor Peter III. Catherine became Empress consort, but not ruler. For more than 16 years she had survived behind palace doors. Now those doors were beginning to open onto something far more dangerous. The lonely outsider had not yet won the empire. But she had persuaded enough of the empire's most powerful insiders to look at her, and to imagine an alternative. When Empress Elizabeth died, the crown passed to her nephew. On January 5, 1762, according to the modern calendar, Grand Duke Peter Fyodorovich became Emperor Peter III of Russia. Catherine, after more than 16 years of waiting behind palace doors, became Empress consort. She was closer to power than ever before. She was also in greater danger. Peter's reign would last only 186 days. Later accounts, written under Catherine and by those who benefited from his removal, often reduced those months to a simple story of incompetence. The truth was less convenient. Peter was capable of acting quickly. He abolished the feared secret chancellery, an institution associated with political investigation, arbitrary detention, and torture. He issued the Manifesto on the Freedom of the Nobility, releasing Russian nobles from the compulsory state service imposed under earlier rulers. He encouraged certain forms of religious toleration and prepared measures to transfer monastic estates to the state. Some of these policies were welcomed. Several would influence reforms later continued in altered form by Catherine herself. Peter did not fall because he did nothing. He fell partly because he tried to do too much too quickly, without securing the loyalty of the people whose cooperation kept an emperor on the throne. The most damaging decision concerned Prussia. Under Empress Elizabeth, Russian armies had fought Frederick II during the 7 Years' War. They had endured brutal campaigns, won victories, occupied East Prussia and entered Berlin. Then Peter, who had admired Frederick since childhood, abruptly ended the struggle. He returned Russia's conquests and made peace with the Prussian king. He went further. Forming an alliance with the ruler Russian soldiers had recently been ordered to defeat. From Peter's point of view, the war had become expensive and strategically unnecessary. Peace with Prussia could allow him to concentrate on the interests of his native Holstein, including a planned conflict with Denmark over Schleswig. To many Russian officers, however, his policy felt like humiliation. Men had watched friends die in the snow and mud, only to see their victories surrendered without compensation. The guards were also offended by Peter's enthusiasm for Prussian drill, Holstein officers, and unfamiliar regulations. The Orthodox hierarchy had reasons to distrust him as well. His proposed treatment of church property and his Lutheran background created fear that he intended to weaken the established faith. Some accusations were exaggerated by his enemies, but in politics, perception could be as destructive as policy. Peter had introduced reforms that could benefit the nobility, yet he alienated influential nobles through his manner, his foreign attachments, and his uncertain plans. He offended military men while preparing a new war that many regarded as a Holstein adventure. And he made little effort to conceal his estrangement from Catherine. He appeared openly with Elizabeth Vorontsova. Rumors circulated that he might divorce Catherine, confine her, or replace her with his favorite. There is not enough evidence to know precisely what Peter intended. But Catherine could not afford to dismiss the possibility. She understood that once Peter felt secure, her position might collapse. Her son Paul could be taken from her permanently. She herself might be sent to a convent or imprisoned. Whether or not such plans had been formally approved, the danger was real enough to shape her choices. During the spring of 1762, a network formed around Catherine. At its center were Grigory Orlov, Catherine's lover and an officer of the guards, and his brothers, especially Alexei Orlov. Other supporters included officers from the Izmailovsky, Semenovsky, and Preobrazhensky regiments, members of influential noble families, and political figures who believed Peter's rule threatened their interests or the stability of Russia. Princess Ekaterina Dashkova, still very young, also supported Catherine and helped connect her cause with aristocratic and military circles. Nikita Panin, associated with the upbringing of the young Paul, viewed Peter with suspicion, although the exact role he played in preparing the coup remains debated. Not all the conspirators imagined the same future. Some may have expected the 7-year-old Paul to become emperor, with Catherine governing as regent. Others were prepared to place Catherine herself on the throne. Catherine could rely on no written constitution and no clear law giving her an independent right to rule. She possessed something more immediate: relationships, courage, and growing support within the regiments that guarded the capital. The conspiracy was dangerous precisely because it could not remain secret forever. On the night of July 8, 1762 by the modern calendar, June 27 according to the Russian calendar then in use, an officer connected to the plot was arrested. The conspirators feared that interrogation would expose them all. There was no longer time to wait. Before dawn, Alexei Orlov hurried to Peterhof, where Catherine was staying apart from her husband. He woke her with the warning that the plan had been discovered. Within minutes, the woman who had spent years learning patience chose speed. She left Peterhof in a carriage, accompanied by only a small number of allies, and raced toward St. Petersburg. On the morning of July 9th, Catherine arrived at the barracks of the Izmailovsky Guards. She did not arrive as the ruler of Russia. She arrived as a wife claiming that her life, her son, the Orthodox faith, and the empire itself were in danger. The officers swore loyalty. Soldiers crowded around her. Bells began to ring, and the movement spread from one regiment to another. The Semenovsky Guards joined her. So did the Preobrazhensky Guards and units of the Horse Guards. What had begun as a frightened journey from Peterhof was becoming a transfer of power in full public view. Catherine went to the Kazan Cathedral, where prayers and religious ceremony helped transform military rebellion into sacred duty. She was proclaimed Catherine II, sovereign Empress of Russia. Her young son Paul stood beside her as the heir, but the crown was claimed in Catherine's name. From the cathedral she proceeded to the Winter Palace. The Senate and the Holy Synod swore allegiance. Crowds gathered in the streets. Although their presence should not be mistaken for a vote by the Russian people. The decisive support came from the guards, senior officials, clergy, and political elites of the capital. Yet the scene had undeniable force. The German-born girl who had once struggled to pronounce Russian prayers was now being acclaimed as the defender of Russia and its Orthodox faith. Catherine changed into the green uniform of a guards officer and mounted a horse. Princess Dashkova also appeared in military dress. The clothing was not a minor theatrical detail. It declared that Catherine was no longer a secluded imperial wife. She was presenting herself as commander, protector, and sovereign. At the head of her supporters, she rode out of St. Petersburg toward Peterhof and Oranienbaum. Later accounts often placed the force accompanying her at approximately 14,000 soldiers. The precise number is difficult to verify, but there is no doubt that Peter now faced a large and rapidly expanding military movement. The capital, the guards, the Senate, and the church leadership had gone over to Catherine. Peter had almost no time to respond. He had been at Oranienbaum with his Hallstein circle. When he reached Peterhof and found Catherine gone, confusion replaced disbelief. Messengers were sent. Orders were discussed and abandoned. Peter considered resistance, but the forces around him were too small and loyalty too uncertain. He attempted to reach the naval fortress of Kronstadt, hoping the fleet would remain faithful. But Catherine's supporters had arrived first. Peter's vessel was refused entry, and the former emperor returned toward Oranienbaum. There was no great battle. No army met Catherine in the fields outside the capital. No artillery shattered the palace walls. Peter asked for negotiation and reportedly offered to share power. Catherine refused. On July 10, with effective resistance impossible, Peter signed an act of abdication. The Emperor of Russia had lost his throne in little more than a day. Peter was taken into custody and sent to Ropsha, an estate outside St. Petersburg. Catherine now possessed the government, but as long as Peter lived, he remained a possible center for rebellion. Supporters could attempt to restore him. Foreign governments could question her legitimacy. Every day of his survival created uncertainty. 8 days after the coup, Peter III died. The official announcement attributed his death to severe illness, traditionally described as hemorrhoidal colic and an apoplectic attack. Few contemporaries found that explanation convincing. Most historians suspect that Peter died violently while being guarded by men connected to the Orlov circle, with Alexei Orlov often named as a central figure. He may have been strangled during a struggle, whether planned in advance or arising from a drunken confrontation. The exact sequence cannot be reconstructed with certainty. There is no conclusive evidence that Catherine personally ordered Peter's murder. There is equally no doubt that his death removed the greatest immediate threat to her new throne, whatever she knew beforehand. She accepted the political benefit and did not publicly punish the men most often associated with his death. For that reason, the coup cannot be remembered as entirely bloodless. Power changed hands in the capital with remarkably little open fighting, but the deposed emperor died in confinement, and the new reign began beneath a shadow that would never completely disappear. Catherine had not been chosen by the entire Russian nation. She had been elevated by a coalition of soldiers, courtiers, clergy, and officials, and by her own willingness to act when hesitation might have destroyed her. She had won the crown. Now she had to prove that taking an empire and governing one were not the same achievement. In September 1762, Catherine entered the Dormition Cathedral in Moscow and received the crown of the Russian Empire. The ceremony offered sacred splendor, but it could not erase the violence and uncertainty behind her rise. Catherine had no independent hereditary claim stronger than that of her son Paul. Her husband had been overthrown and had died in custody. Every reform, victory, and public gesture would now serve a second purpose: to prove that she had been worthy of the throne she seized. She approached government with remarkable energy. Catherine read reports, wrote instructions, questioned officials, and maintained an enormous correspondence. She cultivated the image of a ruler guided by reason rather than inherited habit. Europe would eventually call her reign a golden age. But the gold shone most brightly in palaces, academies, military headquarters, and noble estates. Beyond them lay another Russia, rural, burdened, and largely bound by serfdom. Catherine wanted Europe's intellectual world to accept her as one of its own. In 1763 she began corresponding with Voltaire. Their letters discussed law, religion, war, literature, and Russia's place in Europe. Voltaire praised her as an enlightened sovereign. Catherine offered him attention, patronage, and a distant imperial stage on which his ideas appeared to matter. The relationship was sincere, but it was also useful to both of them. Voltaire gained access to one of Europe's most powerful rulers. Catherine gained an influential defender who helped shape her reputation abroad. She also supported Denis Diderot. When financial difficulties forced the philosopher to consider selling his library, Catherine purchased it, allowed him to keep using the books, and paid him to act as their librarian. Diderot later traveled to St. Petersburg and spoke with her repeatedly about education, law, and the possibility of reform. Catherine listened. She enjoyed argument and admired intellectual courage. But listening was not the same as surrendering power. The philosophers could design ideal societies on paper. Catherine ruled an immense empire through nobles, officials, soldiers, and landowners whose loyalty could not be treated as an abstract question. Her most ambitious attempt to unite philosophy and government appeared in the Nakaz, or instruction, prepared for the Legislative Commission of 1767. Drawing heavily on Montesquieu and Cesare Beccaria, Catherine discussed equality before the law, proportionate punishment, the dangers of torture, and the need for laws suited to the character and conditions of a country. The language could sound bold, even humane. Yet the document also defended autocracy as necessary for governing Russia's enormous territory. Catherine's advisors softened or removed some of her more challenging proposals. Serfdom, the institution shaping the lives of millions, was approached cautiously and never abolished. The commission brought together representatives from government bodies, noble landowners, towns, Cossacks, state peasants, and several ethnic communities. Privately owned serfs, who formed a vast portion of the population, had no direct representation. The deputies spoke for months, revealing competing demands across the empire. They produced information and debate, but no new comprehensive law code. When war with the Ottoman Empire began in 1768, the general meetings ended. The experiment had shown Catherine the possibilities of consultation. It had also shown her how difficult reform became when it threatened privilege. That same year, Catherine confronted a different enemy. Smallpox killed and disfigured people across Europe and Russia. Catherine understood that fear would prevent many Russians from accepting inoculation unless the sovereign provided an example. In 1768, she invited the English physician Thomas Dimsdale to Russia. He performed variolation on Catherine and later on her son Paul, introducing material associated with smallpox into the body to produce a controlled infection and, if successful, future protection. This was not vaccination in the modern sense. Edward Jenner's cowpox-based method would not be demonstrated until 1796. Variolation carried genuine dangers. The patient could become seriously ill, die, or transmit smallpox to others. Catherine accepted that risk in private. When she recovered, the court celebrated publicly, and her example made inoculation more acceptable among the Russian elite. Dimsdale and his son were rewarded generously, and inoculation programs expanded. The decision was courageous but also carefully political. By placing her own body at risk, Catherine presented reason, medicine, and imperial leadership as part of the same project. Art offered another language of power. In 1764, Catherine acquired more than 200 European paintings assembled by the Berlin merchant Johann Ernst Gotskowski. The purchase is generally treated as the beginning of the collection that became the State Hermitage Museum. She continued buying on a vast scale: Dutch and Flemish masters, Italian paintings, French drawings, classical objects, coins, books, and entire private collections. Agents searched European markets on her behalf. Buildings and galleries were created beside the Winter Palace to contain these treasures. Catherine called the private retreat her hermitage, a place of seclusion where a limited circle could dine, converse, watch performances, and view art away from the full ceremony of court. It was not yet a public museum. Ordinary Russians could not wander through its galleries. The collection advertised imperial wealth and Catherine's claim that Russia belonged within the highest culture of Europe. Yet it also preserved works, encouraged scholarship, and created the foundations of one of the world's great museums. In Catherine's reign, culture and authority were never far apart. Education belonged to the same vision. In 1764, Catherine founded the Smolny Institute for Daughters of the Nobility, an important beginning for formal women's education in Russia. A related school later admitted girls from non-noble urban families. The curriculum was intended to form disciplined, cultivated women who could influence family and society. The project was innovative but narrow. It reached only a small number of children in an empire of millions, while most peasant girls, and most peasant boys, remained outside formal schooling. Catherine also supported the Free Economic Society, founded in 1765 to gather knowledge about agriculture and improve estate management. Its members discussed crops, technology, and the condition of rural labor. Yet discussion rarely altered the basic relationship on which noble estates depended. Landowners commanded, while serfs worked under obligations they had not chosen. Enlightenment created institutions, experiments, and a new public language. It did not dissolve the hierarchy that sustained the throne. The empire's transformation was not achieved by books and paintings alone. In 1768, war began with the Ottoman Empire. Russian armies advanced across the northern Black Sea region while a Russian fleet sailed into the Mediterranean. At Chezham in 1770, the Ottoman fleet suffered a devastating defeat. On land, commanders such as Pyotr Rumyantsev won victories that altered the balance of power in southeastern Europe. The Treaty of Kukuk-Kainarka ended the war in 1774. Russia gained important fortresses and access around the Black Sea, as well as commercial rights. The Crimean Khanate was declared independent of Ottoman political authority, but in practice it increasingly fell under Russian influence. The treaty was a triumph for Catherine. For the Ottoman Empire and the peoples living between the two powers, it marked the beginning of deeper instability. Even as peace was being negotiated, rebellion was burning inside Russia. In 1773, the Cossack Yemelian Pugachev claimed that he was Peter III, miraculously alive and returning to punish corrupt nobles. His movement drew support from Yake Cossacks, serfs, factory workers, old believers, Bashkirs, Tatars, and other communities carrying different grievances against the imperial state. The rebellion spread across the Volga and Ural regions, besieged Orenburg, seized much of Kazan, and for a time alarmed Moscow. Violence was committed by the rebels, and the government's suppression was also severe. Pugachev was captured, taken to Moscow, and executed in January 1775. For Catherine, the uprising carried a brutal message. The philosopher Empress could correspond with Voltaire about law and humanity, but millions of rural subjects experienced the empire through landlords, taxes, military recruitment, forced labor, and distant officials. After the revolt, Catherine did not abolish serfdom. She strengthened provincial administration and depended more firmly on the nobility to maintain order. The Golden Age was also an age of tighter control. To the south, Russian influence over Crimea became intervention, occupation, and finally annexation. The Crimean Khanate had been declared independent in 1774, but its independence was largely nominal. Russian forces and political pressure shaped the choice of khans and the direction of government. Revolts and factional struggles weakened the peninsula. In 1783, on the advice of Grigory Potemkin, Catherine formally annexed Crimea, Taman, and lands around the Kuban. For Russia, the annexation opened the way to a permanent Black Sea fleet and new ports. Sevastopol became the principal naval base in Crimea. Kherson and other southern settlements became centers of military, commercial, and colonizing ambition. For the Crimean Tatars, the change meant the destruction of their Khanate, loss of political independence, pressure on landholding, and waves of emigration. The annexation was not simply the peaceful arrival of modern government. It was an act of imperial conquest with lasting human consequences. The Ottoman Empire attempted to reverse the change in another war beginning in 1787. Russian victories followed, and the Treaty of Jassy in 1792 confirmed Russian possession of Crimea. By then, Catherine's empire reached more securely toward the Black Sea than any previous Russian state. She had not transformed an insignificant country into a great power. Russia had already become a major European force under Peter the Great and Empress Elizabeth. Catherine inherited that power, expanded it, and gave it new cultural confidence and territorial reach. Her Russia could defeat armies, influence courts, collect the treasures of Europe, and speak the language of the Enlightenment. It could also silence rebellion, preserve serfdom, and absorb neighboring peoples in the name of security and glory. That contradiction stood at the center of Catherine's golden age. In early February 1774, Catherine spent her first private hours with Grigory Potemkin at Tsarskoye Selo. She was 44 years old and had ruled Russia for more than a decade. He was a decorated officer, nearly 10 years younger, who had served during the coup that placed her on the throne. Outside the palace, the empire faced war, rebellion, and uncertainty. Inside, Catherine was falling in love with an intensity that surprised even her. More than 1,000 notes and letters associated with their relationship survive. They reveal tenderness, jealousy, humor, argument, political calculation, and a need for reassurance. Catherine could command armies and dismiss ministers, yet in these pages she worried about silence, absence, and whether she was still loved. The letters offer something official portraits rarely permit. They show the Empress as a human being. Potemkin was not Catherine's first important companion. Before him came Grigory Orlov, the Guards officer whose relationship with Catherine began while she was still married to Peter. Orlov and his brothers helped organize the coup of 1762. Without their influence among the Guards, Catherine might never have taken the throne. Shortly before the coup, Catherine gave birth to Alexei Bobrinsky, widely recognized as her son by Orlov. The child was raised away from the center of court life, where his existence might have created political danger. For years, Orlov possessed wealth, rank, and access to the sovereign. Catherine reportedly considered marrying him, but a public marriage would have created serious problems. Orlov came from a noble family but not a ruling dynasty. Making him an imperial husband might have weakened Catherine's already uncertain legitimacy, divided her supporters, and suggested that the man beside the throne intended to share it. Their relationship gradually deteriorated. Orlov's infidelities, court rivalries, and Catherine's declining confidence in his political abilities all contributed. By 1772, another companion had taken his place. This pattern would later be turned into a story of endless appetite. A ruler discarding one man after another without loyalty or restraint. The evidence is more complicated. Catherine had a limited series of documented relationships, generally one at a time across several decades. Some were brief, others lasted for years. Several men received enormous gifts, estates, titles, and positions. The system encouraged rivalry and could waste state resources. It was not merely private romance without public consequences. But it was also not the uncontrolled spectacle described by hostile pamphlets and later legend. Grigory Potemkin was different from the men who came before and after him. He was born into the provincial nobility near Smolensk and educated in Moscow before entering military life. He was intelligent, ambitious, theatrical, deeply religious, sensual, unpredictable, and capable of moving rapidly between extraordinary energy and dark withdrawal. He had participated in Catherine's seizure of power in 1762 and later distinguished himself during the war against the Ottoman Empire. By the time he returned to her intimate circle in 1774, he had become more than an attractive officer. He possessed strategic imagination and understood the possibilities of Russia's southern frontier. The early stage of their relationship was passionate and turbulent. Catherine admired his intelligence and humor. Potemkin wanted affection, but he also wanted authority. Both were accustomed to commanding others. Neither found obedience natural. Their letters moved between devotion and quarrel with astonishing speed. Catherine sometimes addressed him in language suggesting that she regarded him as a husband. This has led many historians to believe that Catherine and Potemkin entered a secret marriage, probably during the 1770s. Such a marriage would have been private and unequal in rank, allowing Catherine to preserve supreme authority while recognizing their bond before the church. But no conclusive marriage certificate or uncontested eyewitness account survives. The possibility is strong, certainty is impossible. A responsible history must leave the door partly open. By 1776, the most intense phase of their physical relationship had ended. In another royal court that might have meant disgrace and exile, Potemkin remained. Their romance changed into an enduring political partnership. Catherine retained the final authority, but Potemkin became one of the few people who could challenge her, advise her frankly, and propose projects on an imperial scale. He supervised vast southern territories, encouraged the construction of towns and ports, organized the Black Sea Fleet, managed relations with Cossacks and neighboring peoples, and played a central role in the annexation and development of Crimea. His achievements were real, so were the costs. The Southern Project displaced existing political systems, expanded Russian settlement, pressured local and Muslim communities, and served further wars against the Ottoman Empire. New ports and administrative centers represented progress from St. Petersburg's perspective. For many people already living there, they represented conquest. Catherine and Potemkin shared the ambition. They must also share historical responsibility for its consequences. In 1787, Catherine traveled south in an immense imperial procession. Foreign diplomats and Emperor Joseph II accompanied portions of the journey. Potemkin arranged ceremonies, illuminated riverbanks, military reviews, decorated settlements, and carefully presented evidence of development. From this journey came the enduring expression, Potemkin Village. According to the famous story, Potemkin built hollow facades along Catherine's route, moved the same well-dressed peasants from place to place, and deceived the Empress into believing that empty lands had become prosperous communities. Modern historians generally regard the most elaborate version of this story as hostile exaggeration. The accusation was popularized by critics, including a diplomat who had not accompanied the Crimean journey. Potemkin certainly staged the visit and displayed the most impressive results while concealing poverty and disorder. Some settlements may have been temporarily decorated, but towns, ports, fortifications, farms, and the Black Sea Fleet could not be folded up and carried downstream overnight. The development was uneven and propagandistic, but it was not entirely imaginary. The legend survived because it offered a perfect political metaphor, a beautiful surface hiding an empty reality. Its usefulness as a metaphor became stronger than its value as history. After Potemkin ceased to be Catherine's exclusive lover, other favorites entered her private life. Most were younger officers selected from the court and guards. Potemkin sometimes participated in these transitions or accepted them, although the precise arrangements cannot always be reconstructed. None of these men replaced him politically. Some companions offered Catherine affection and conversation without becoming major statesmen. Others and their families pursued wealth, titles, and influence. Catherine could be generous to the point of extravagance. Favoritism created genuine opportunities for corruption and resentment. It is therefore unnecessary to invent sexual crimes in order to criticize her. Her documented actions already provide enough material for judgment: autocracy, patronage, imperial expansion, and the preservation of serfdom. Yet Catherine's enemies repeatedly reduced a 34-year reign to the body of an aging woman. Male monarchs could maintain mistresses, produce illegitimate children, and distribute estates without having their entire political careers explained as sexual disorder. Catherine's relationships were treated differently because she was a woman who exercised authority over both the state and her own private life. The number of her lovers grew with every hostile retelling. Gossip became pornography, and pornography became popular memory. The most infamous legend claims that Catherine died during a sexual encounter with a horse. There is no evidence for it. No contemporary medical report, court record, credible witness, or serious historical source supports the story. She did not die beneath an animal or because of any sexual accident. The tale belongs to the history of political and misogynistic slander, not to the history of Catherine's death. Its persistence reveals less about the Empress than about the discomfort created by a powerful woman, whose private choices could not be controlled by a husband. The most difficult relationship in Catherine's life may not have been romantic at all. Her son Paul had been removed from her care soon after birth and raised under Empress Elizabeth's supervision. The emotional distance created in childhood never fully disappeared. As Paul grew older, he resented his exclusion from government and remained haunted by the overthrow and death of his father. Catherine, in turn, distrusted his judgment and feared what he might undo if he inherited the throne. When Paul had sons of his own, Catherine took a leading role in the upbringing of Alexander and Constantine. In doing so, she repeated part of the pattern that Elizabeth had imposed upon her. The grandmother who had once been separated from her infant now separated another mother and father from the education of their children. Power could teach survival without teaching tenderness. In October 1791, Potemkin became gravely ill while conducting imperial business and peace negotiations in Moldavia. He attempted to travel from Yashi toward Nikolaev, but his strength failed. He died in the open countryside. When the news reached Catherine, witnesses described her as devastated. The man who had been her lover, possible secret husband, political partner, rival, advisor, and friend for nearly 2 decades was gone. Other favorites remained at court. Ministers continued to deliver their reports. The empire did not stop moving. But one of the few people who had spoken to Catherine as something close to an equal would never write to her again. By the end of 1791, Grigory Potemkin was dead, and Catherine stood closer to the end of her reign than anyone at court wished to say. She was 62 years old. For nearly 3 decades she had ruled one of the largest empires on earth. Crimea had been annexed, new cities faced the Black Sea, and Catherine had become one of the defining monarchs of her century. But victory did not bring peace. Beyond Russia's borders, revolution was transforming the ideas Catherine had once used to describe her rule. At home, she was becoming more suspicious of dissent. Poland was attempting to escape Russian control. And within the imperial family, an old question was becoming unavoidable. Who would inherit her empire? When the French Revolution began in 1789, Catherine initially followed events with the intense curiosity of a ruler who had spent decades discussing law, reason, and reform. Yet the revolution did not remain a philosophical debate. The French monarchy collapsed. Violence spread through Paris and the provinces. Louis XVI was executed in January 1793. Anne-Marie Antoinette followed him to the guillotine later that year. To Catherine, the killings revealed what could happen when criticism escaped state control. The language of liberty, once exchanged safely in books and letters, now seemed connected to rebellion, regicide, and war. Catherine had never been a revolutionary. Her admiration for Enlightenment thought had always existed beside a commitment to autocracy. She welcomed criticism that might improve administration, but not the right of subjects to remove their sovereign. As revolution spread fear through Europe, the limits of her tolerance became increasingly visible. In 1790, Alexander Radishchev published A Journey from St. Petersburg to Moscow. The book used scenes observed along the road between the imperial capitals to expose cruelty, corruption, and the suffering created by serfdom. Catherine read it not as a proposal for gradual reform, but as a dangerous attack on the foundations of the state. Radishchev was condemned to death. Catherine commuted the sentence, sending him into Siberian exile. 2 years later, the publisher Nikolai Novikov was arrested. Novikov had helped expand Russian literary and intellectual life, but his printing activity, religious connections, and independent influence now aroused imperial suspicion. He was imprisoned at Schlüsselburg without a public trial and remained there until Paul released him after Catherine's death. These cases did not erase everything Catherine had supported. Schools still existed. Books continued to circulate. The collections she had assembled remained. But fear had narrowed the space in which ideas could move safely. The Empress who had once invited Europe to judge her as enlightened now treated some forms of independent thought as threats to survival. Nowhere were the contradictions of Catherine's final years more destructive than in Poland. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had once been one of Europe's largest states. By the late 18th century, internal division and foreign interference had weakened its political system. Russia dominated its affairs. Stanislav August Poniatowski, Catherine's former lover, had been elected king in 1764 with Russian support. But he was not simply her obedient servant. He and other reformers hoped to rebuild the Commonwealth and rescue it from political paralysis. On May 3, 1791, the Commonwealth adopted a constitution designed to strengthen central government, limit the destructive liberum veto, and create a more effective constitutional monarchy. To its supporters, it offered peaceful national renewal. To Catherine, it threatened Russian influence and appeared dangerously close to the reforming spirit that was unsettling Europe. Polish nobles opposed to the constitution formed the Targowica Confederation and appealed to Russia for support. In 1792, Russian armies invaded. The reformers were defeated and the constitution was overturned. In the Second Partition of 1793, Russia and Prussia seized enormous territories from the weakened Commonwealth. The following year, Tadeusz Kościuszko led an uprising in a final attempt to defend Polish independence. The revolt mobilized soldiers, townspeople, and some peasants. But it could not overcome the forces assembled against it. Russian and Prussian armies crushed the resistance. In 1795, Russia, Prussia, and Austria carried out the Third Partition. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth disappeared from the political map of Europe. At the Russian court, this was presented as strategy and imperial achievement. For the people whose state had been destroyed, it was conquest. The partitions brought vast territories and millions of new subjects under Romanov rule. Poles, Lithuanians, Belarusians, Ukrainians, Jews, and others whose histories could not be reduced to a new color on an imperial map. Catherine had enlarged Russia. But she had also extended its power over societies that did not choose to be absorbed. The achievement and the violence were part of the same act. In Catherine's final years, the court watched another relationship with growing unease. Platon Zubov had become her favorite in 1789. He was young and far less experienced than Potemkin. After Potemkin's death, his influence increased while his family pursued office and wealth. Catherine's enemies used the relationship as further proof that an aging woman had surrendered judgment to desire. That interpretation was shaped by the same double standard that had followed her throughout her reign. Male monarchs maintained mistresses and promoted favorites without having their entire political careers reduced to sexual appetite. Yet criticism of Zubov was not entirely invented. He lacked Potemkin's strategic ability, and his family's rise encouraged resentment. Catherine remained sovereign, but many experienced servants were gone. She seemed increasingly isolated within a court preoccupied with what would follow her death. The answer should have been simple. Her son Paul was the lawful heir. But almost nothing between Catherine and Paul was simple. Sound, children's footsteps cross a gallery. A clock begins to mark the hour. Paul had grown up under Empress Elizabeth's supervision, separated from Catherine in infancy. As an adult, he carried that injury and the knowledge that his mother had seized the throne from his father. Catherine considered Paul unstable, resentful, and politically unprepared. Paul believed that she kept him from the role that birth had assigned him. Their distrust hardened across the decades. The Empress increasingly placed her hopes in Paul's eldest son, Alexander. She supervised the boy's education and imagined a ruler who might combine intelligence, discipline, and devotion to Russia. Alexander was caught between a grandmother who shaped his future and a father who expected his loyalty. Catherine appears to have considered bypassing Paul and naming Alexander as her successor. Later accounts claim that she was preparing a formal act to do so. But no completed and legally effective change was publicly established before her death. Her intentions never became a secure settlement. That failure mattered. Catherine had managed wars, rebellions, diplomacy, and the ambitions of powerful nobles. Yet she could not resolve the succession without risking a family conflict at the center of the empire. Time made the decision for her. On November 16, 1796, Catherine began her mourning at the Winter Palace according to familiar habits. She rose, drank coffee, and attended to the private routine that preceded the work of the day. Then she collapsed. Servants found her unconscious. Physicians recognized that she had suffered a severe stroke. She never regained the ability to rule or speak clearly. 4 hours, courtiers waited as the machinery of succession began moving through the palace. Catherine died on the evening of November 17, 1796. She was 67 years old. The reality was solemn and ordinary, an aging ruler struck down by a catastrophic medical event. But reality did not satisfy her enemies. Almost immediately, obscene stories attached themselves to her death. The most famous claimed that she had been killed during a sexual encounter with a horse. It was false. The tale had no credible evidence behind it. It transformed a powerful woman into a grotesque joke and allowed generations of readers to remember slander more easily than statecraft. The myth endured because it served a purpose. Catherine had violated expectations surrounding gender, marriage, sexuality, and authority. A degrading sexual death seemed to punish her for ruling without apology. She died of a stroke. Paul became emperor. One of Paul's first symbolic acts was to honor the father he believed Catherine had displaced. He ordered the remains of Peter III removed from their earlier burial place and reinterred with full ceremony in the Cathedral of Saints Peter and Paul. Peter's coffin was placed beside Catherine's. In death, the estranged couple was reunited by the son whose life had been shaped by their conflict. Paul also reversed some of his mother's decisions and dismissed people associated with her final court. But he could not reverse the scale of what she had built. Catherine had ruled for 34 years. Russia expanded toward the Black Sea and into the former Polish, Lithuanian Commonwealth. Its army and diplomacy became central to Europe. New cities and institutions appeared. The future Hermitage grew under her patronage. Education expanded, provincial government was reorganized, and Catherine promoted inoculation by publicly accepting its risks herself. She corresponded with philosophers, wrote laws, plays, histories, and instructions, and created an image of Russia as a participant in European intellectual life rather than a distant observer. But her achievements rested on foundations she would not transform. Autocracy remained absolute. Serfdom survived and, in important regions, expanded with the empire. The nobility gained privileges while millions of peasants remained bound to landlords. Rebellion was answered with overwhelming force. Independent Poland was destroyed. Imperial growth brought prestige to St. Petersburg and subordination to many people beyond it. Catherine spoke the language of reason, but preserved a political system that denied most subjects a voice. She wanted better laws, yet would not allow law to limit the sovereign decisively. She valued talent and intellect, but punished writers when their criticism approached the structure of her power. These contradictions do not make her achievements imaginary. Nor do those achievements erase the suffering her rule protected or created. In 1744, a 14-year-old German princess had traveled through the snow toward a country she barely knew. She had little money of her own, no certainty of marriage, and no guarantee that the Russian court would accept her. She changed her faith, her name, her language, and the performance of her identity. She survived a disastrous marriage, the hostility of a guarded court, and the danger of a coup. Then she seized the throne and held it longer than any other woman in Russian history. She was neither the flawless philosopher Empress of her official portraits nor the insatiable monster invented by hostile gossip. She was a brilliant political survivor, an ambitious imperial ruler, a patron of culture, a defender of autocracy, and a woman whose intelligence was matched by a formidable willingness to use power. Her reign made Russia larger, stronger, and more influential. It also made its unresolved injustices larger. Sound, dawn touches the Neva. One final bell sounds across the frozen city. The outsider had entered Russia seeking survival. She left it an empire enlarged in her image, and burdened by contradictions she never resolved.